Here we go. Tonight we're going to be talking about one of the real seminal figures in post Talmudic life of the Jewish people, which is Rabeinu Gershom, known as the Meor HaGola, the light of the exile. So he's a very seminal figure. He wasn't literally a teacher of Rashi, but he was sort of a conceptual. Rashi was of the school of Rabeinu Gershom. So let's get some facts and figures, and we'll tell some of the stories about his identity. He was born in France in about the year 960. You know, our records are a little shaky from that time. We tend to be more familiar with when a person died, because then you knew to pay attention. When they were born, you didn't always know. So he was born in a city called Metz in France, as I said, in 960, and he died in 1040 in Mainz, Germany. His primary teacher was Yehuda HaKohen ben Meir, who also had been recognized by the monarch, and he was knighted. He was known as Sir Leofitin. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it was just a curiosity to show about how there was always this tension, and we'll see how it manifests itself with Rabeinu Gershom personally, between the local governments and the great Jewish scholars. They often respected them. They even sought out their guidance and advice. And yet sometimes there was this more than a little bit of friction between them. He established a great academy in his native city, and many of his direct students turned out to be Rashi's teachers. But particularly, Rabeinu Gershom had a student named Rabbi Yaakov ben Yakar, who was one of Rashi's most well-known teachers. Rabeinu Gershom, and this may sound a little odd in our modern society, but one of the greatest compliments to illustrate the stature that he reached is that his teacher, Yehuda HaKohen ben Meir, married his daughter, Devorah, off to Rabeinu Gershom. Unfortunately, they never had children. Rabeinu Gershom and Devorah never had children. They were able to go to a large city in Babylonia, which is modern-day Iraq, called Pumbedisa, to a great yeshiva that was led by a man of what was called the Gaonic period, Reb Shmuel Gaon. And there, Rabeinu Gershom became eventually the head of that yeshiva. As is common, and again, a little bit our common experience today in our days, but Rabeinu Gershom did not earn his living only from his academic teaching. He also became a skilled goldsmith, and that becomes very particularly relevant as his life goes on, as we'll tell the story. He wound up settling in Constantinople, Istanbul, and Turkey, which was a great metropolis, a great city of commerce, and a very profound and strong Jewish community. In fact, just to take it to the modern day, Rabbi Mendy Chitrik is the shliach in Turkey, and there is still a vibrant Jewish community, both an Ashkenaz and a Sephardic Jewish community. Because remember, although the Turks are Muslim, they are not Arabs, so they are not innately evil or cruel to the Jewish people. There was another story that occurred that in the city of Constantinople, there was a terrible fire, and people, obviously, many died, lost their homes, and many sick and so forth. And Rabeinu Gershom also had some medical training. Again, it probably wouldn't match what we would think of in our modern times, but he threw himself into the rescue effort. This caught the attention of the king, whose name was Basil. He was a good guy, basically, but he was subject to being misled. And he was very impressed with Rabeinu Gershom, and he brought Rabeinu Gershom into his inner circle. And as often happens when he brings somebody into the inner circle, well, other people who are already in the inner circle, they don't like it so much. They have jealousy, they try to besmirch people. Maybe that is very much like our modern society. When people start getting ahead and they start getting the attention of the leaders, there is a tendency for some of the other advisors to not be so down with it. Well, this Basil learned about the famed throne of Shlomo HaMelech. Now, at the risk of being a little bit silly, for those who ever took their kids to the old Coal Museum, not the new one that's in Glenview, but people whose kids are maybe in their 20s now or 30, they used to be the Coal Museum. There's a point to this story, don't worry. in Wilmette on Golf Road, and they had actually a replica of this Solomon's throne. People remember, and the Solomon's throne had this fantastic description where it had steps, and as he walked up the steps, there were these different figures of birds, and they would sing, and so on. And when Basil heard about this, he said, "Wow, this is magic and miracle." And Rabeinu Gershom said, "It's not. It's engineering. We tend to think that all engineering began, last week with Steve Jobs, but he says it's engineering, and it's not magic or miracles. It's something that was designed and so forth." And at the end, when Solomon would sit down, these two figurines of birds would lower the crown onto his head. And if anyone has ever been to these homes, like these Revolutionary War or Civil War homes, and so on, you often see more profound engineering than just what we have in the computer. There's an app for that. Well, there were no apps, and these people really had to invent these types of things. So when Basil learned about this, he was totally enthralled, and he said, "Can you build me this throne?" And Rabeinu Gershom, who had training in the goldsmith, and he knew that he had to be very careful to keep the king on the good side of the Jews, he said, "Yeah, I could do it." So the king says, "Fine, no expense spared, you can do it." But and Rabeinu Gershom was suspicious, more than a little suspicious, that you're going to have a lot of workers, things get stolen. It's a curious point that in Torah, in contrast, when the Jewish people come together to build the Mishkan, the traveling sanctuary, as a remedy for the sin of the golden calf, they have so much, the people are so generous that the construction team comes to Moshe and says, "Tell the people to stop sending, don't send any more stuff." And it's curious to note that when they do, they all come to Moshe, every single person. So you say, why do we need every single person? You send the foreman, send the master designer, because you can imagine if one guy's missing, then everybody gets suspicious if anything is in fact missing. Oh, that's the guy who stole it. Where was Murray? He didn't come with us. So, it's very much hands on the table. Everybody's got to be very honest. So Rabeinu Gershom was very suspicious that this would not be the case. They wouldn't be so honest. So he elicited from the king a blanket exoneration that regardless of how much silver they use, because the king couldn't afford to make it out of gold, he make it out of silver, Rabeinu Gershom would not be held responsible for any thievery. And he said, fine. And the king authorized basically whatever Rabeinu Gershom wanted. And he built this elaborate, gorgeous, stunning throne. And it was, the envy of all who saw. Well, the king was overjoyed, thrilled. He was so happy with it. And as often happens, there was another cabinet member. His name is recorded as having been John. And he was very, very jealous of how the king was so enthralled with this Rabeinu Gershom. So he started to slander Rabeinu Gershom. He told the king, this Rabeinu Gershom, you think he's so honest? He actually stole some of the silver, you'll see. He claims that he used it all for the throne, but he really didn't, and blah, blah, blah. So, like water on a rock, eventually it makes its way through. So the king comes to Rabeinu Gershom. He says, hey, did you steal silver? I want to know. I want to see an accounting of every ounce of silver you use. Right? So, well, we made a deal. I don't care about the deal. There's no justice. There's no appealing it. I want to know exactly how much. But Rabeinu Gershom was saved by one issue. The issue was they had no way of weighing such a large object, this throne. So even if they knew exactly how many ounces of silver had been allocated to the building of this throne, there was no way of knowing now how much the throne weighed unless you dismantled the whole throne. So the king was stuck. There was no way he could prove how much silver had been used. So the king put out a big reward. Anyone who could figure out a way to measure, to weigh the throne without dismantling it will get a great reward. And this way they could weigh it against what they knew had been allocated. Of course, nobody could figure out any way, but everyone knew there was one guy who knew. Not to be overly silly or disrespectful, but Sirhan. You didn't think I was going to make a Sirhan reference in the story, did you? I could see you weren't expecting that. But he was paroled, I think, or he's up for parole. The last time he was up for parole, I'm not even making this up. he was denied parole. And he said, Robert Kennedy would have paroled me. And there was one commentator said, of all the luck, the one guy who would have paroled him is the guy he shot. What a that's bad luck. So who's the one guy who would know how to weigh the throne without dismantling it? Rabeinu Gershom himself. But of course, he's not going to tell. Anybody here want to raise their hand and venture a guess as to how you could weigh the throne without dismantling it? They don't have a large enough scale. This is 1,200 years ago. Anybody know? Come on, don't be shy. I'll tell you, I told this story to a friend of mine who's a jeweler, and he told me that in jewelry training, they tell a very similar story. They tell it about a crown, but it's got to be the same. So, little background here. Rabeinu Gershom and his wife, as we mentioned, her name was Devorah, never had children. It was very sad. As a result, it was not uncommon, he married another woman. And this woman was not a good person. And she saw this as an opportunity for her to advance herself with the king. If she could coax from Rabeinu Gershom how, in fact, they could weigh the throne. Not unlike Delilah, or Delilah, she's sometimes called, who was married to Shimshon, and she elicited from him how they could neutralize his strength, and then she turned on him and she gave it to the Philistines, who in fact did that, and they cut his hair, as you remember the story. So he told her what to do, and she ratted about, and of course, when they followed through, they realized that there was more silver allocated than there was silver in the throne. I'll tell you how they did it, don't worry, but you gotta have to stay to the end. And as such, Rabeinu Gershom was sentenced to die in a tower. And this was the cruelties of that time. Again, 1,200 years ago, in the year 1000 and so. So he was put in this tower where he was locked in with nothing to starve to death. So he's there, in total despair, and there's one little window, but he's, however many feet up. And his first wife, who was still his wife, Devorah, comes and she cries out to him. She says, I'm going to stay here with you until you die. He says, no, I have a solution. I have a plan how you can get me out. I'll tell you that too. But before I do, because you got to stay to the end. Rabeinu Gershom was also famous. One of the great contributions he made to Jewish life are things that some of them we put into practice. There would be these rabbinic conferences where they would create what is called in Hebrew takanas, communal decrees. And Rabeinu Gershom oversaw this. And one of the communal decrees that he made was that you are not permitted to read another person's mail. Now, we practice this pretty routinely, and everyone gets the email on the bottom. There's a 20-page disclaimer about how this is only intended for the recipient and so on. Meanwhile, everybody puts their whole life on Facebook, and so on. In fact, there was a practice where people would seal their letters with an abbreviation indicating that they held of, or they were enforcing better, the takana, this decree of Rabeinu Gershom. Another decree of Rabeinu Gershom, which was only accepted by the Ashkenazi community, is the prohibition of a man marrying more than one wife, what we call polygamy. We know that in Torah it's permitted. And in some Sephardic communities, even into the 20th century, it was not uncommon practice. Although I don't believe it's still practiced in many Jewish communities that I'm aware of to this day. Another issue that Rabeinu Gershom created is that he prohibited a man from forcing a get onto his wife. We know that there's a terrible issue that exists in the community, tragically, in Jewish communities. It's the plight of the aguna, which is a woman whose husband refuses to give her a get. And therefore she's sort of trapped and she can't get remarried. And we apply every kind of communal pressure that we know, even taking the guy down to the basement and reminding him of what he really wanted to do, in order to force the guy, if it's reached such a degree, that he should issue a get. But what consequence is there to the man? What if the woman doesn't want to accept the get? Well, biblically, the man can force the get upon the woman. But Rabeinu Gershom, in an attempt to protect women, he instituted this prohibition that exists to this day. So, yes, people are familiar with the plight of the aguna. The same is true for the man. If the wife refuses to receive the get, the man cannot force the get upon her. Now, there is a workaround, which is not such a simple thing. And it does happen in the rarest occasions, which is not so easy, where the man would have to get 100 different rabbis from different communities. He'd have to go and petition each one of them and tell them his whole story about why his wife is being so completely unreasonable not to accept the get, and have them sign off. So it's not undone. It has happened, but it's pretty rare. These are takanas. These are ways which Rabeinu Gershom improve the community and the plight of people. Okay, I'm going to tell you the answer to how you weigh the throne and how Rabeinu Gershom got out of the tower. He said, this is what you do with the throne. Anyone want to venture a guess? Anyone want to unmute themselves and say how would you weigh this throne without a scale that can handle that weight? When I tell you, you're going to say, oh yeah, I should have thought of that. Come on, somebody jump forward. Nobody? I'll tell you. Through displacement. That is, he said, this is what you do. You take a little rowboat into a still lake, you put weight on it, and you measure as it goes down. You mark the boat. This is how far down it goes with. I'm making it up, 50 pounds, 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 250 pounds, whatever it is. Then you know. Then you empty it up, then you put the throne on. You see how far down it goes. Bada boom, you have the weight. You've been able to measure it. And that's how they determined that, in fact, the allocated quantity of silver was more than the sum weight of the throne. So they put him in the tower. How did he get out of the tower? So he told his wife, go and get a silkworm and have the silkworm work its way up the side of the tower with the slightest thread of silk. And then tie a teeny little piece of thread to that silk. And Rabeinu Gershom would pull up the piece of thread, then another piece of thread, and another piece of thread, and another piece of thread, another piece of thread, until you get a yarn, until you get a small rope, until you get a bigger rope, and a bigger rope, and a bigger rope, and a bigger rope, until you have a heavy-duty rope pulled up to the top of the tower, where Rabeinu Gershom could tie it on to a bar and lower himself down very gently and gradually to the side of the tower and escape together with his wife, and lived on to tell the tale. So he is Rabeinu Gershom Meor HaGola, the light of the diaspora. All right, so those were two riddles for you. Try that out on your friends. How to weigh something that's so heavy when you don't have a scale, and how to escape a tower if you're ever trapped. Tomorrow night, we'll talk about getting ready for Yontif. And Wednesday night, we hope to feature a special guest, which is my way of saying I haven't found anybody yet. And somebody asked me to record this one, so I will send it out. And Thursday night, we'll talk some parsha. So good night, everybody.
You happen to find the page by page for Rosh Hashanah?
Not for this year, only the one we had from last year. So I'm sorry, I don't know, because people, thank God, are being mostly in shul. So I haven't seen some repair, but when I do, I didn't forget. Well, I did forget, but now you remind me.
Are we going to be starting at 9 o'clock?
Yes, we're 9 o'clock. We're 9 o'clock now.
Okay.
Forward, 9 o'clock. Okay, I'll send out the recording from tonight, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Be well.